The morning Paul Monroe decided not to ride out was the morning Annie Garrison decided she might survive after all. It was the spring of 1876, deep in the Texas Panhandle, in a town called Cowboy Creek that barely deserved the name. It sat on the edge of the Llano Estacado like a sunburned afterthought, a trading post, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a doctor's office, a church that leaked when it rained, and a scattering of homesteads that clung to the red earth the way desperate things always do, with everything they had and a prayer on top of that. The nearest proper town was 2 days' ride to the south, and the nearest law was 3. Cowboy Creek was the kind of place that built people strong if it didn't break them first, and in the spring of 1876, it was doing its level best to break Annie Garrison entirely. Her father, Thomas Garrison, had died the previous November, a fever that came in fast and left even faster, taking him with it before the first hard frost settled on the ground. He'd left Annie the homestead, 40 acres of dry, stubborn land with a creek that ran honest in spring and turned miserly by August, a 2-room cabin that needed the roof patched before summer, a barn with a mule named Chester and 4 laying hens, and a debt to a man named Harold Fitch that sat on top of all of it like a stone. Harold Fitch was the kind of man who wore his money the way other men wore hats, conspicuously, to make you feel small. He owned the trading post and the livery, and had a 3rd stake in the saloon, and he'd been lending money across Cowboy Creek for 15 years with the patience of someone who knew the land would always make people desperate. Thomas Garrison had borrowed $400 from Harold Fitch to buy seed and fence the eastern pasture and keep the place running through 2 bad harvests. $400 in 1874 had become $600 by the spring of 1876, and Harold Fitch came by the Garrison homestead on the 1st of May to remind Annie of that fact in a manner that was polite enough on the surface and uglier than a drought underneath it. Annie was 24 years old. She had dark brown hair that she kept braided when she was working and loose when she wasn't, which meant it was almost always braided. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's stubbornness. Her mother had died when Annie was 11 from a wagon accident on the flat road south, and the stubbornness was really all she'd been left with from that loss, that and a knowledge of how to be alone. She was not a woman who asked for help easily. She had been raised to handle things herself, to put her head down and push through, and so when Harold Fitch stood on her porch and talked about the debt and the land and the various options available to a young woman in her position, she looked him directly in the eye and told him she would have the money by harvest time. She had no idea how. The other homesteaders who'd borrowed from Fitch had ridden out over the winter and early spring. The Caldwell family packed their wagon in February and headed east toward a relative in Arkansas. The Hennessy brothers, who'd been working a claim just north of the creek, vanished one morning without even leaving the cabin locked. A widow named Sadie Pratt, who had tried to run a small boarding house, had sold her furniture piece by piece, and then followed the furniture east, leaving in March with nothing but a carpet bag and her youngest boy hanging off her arm. One by one, the people Fitch had lent money to were cutting their losses and leaving Cowboy Creek behind, and Fitch himself seemed perfectly satisfied to watch the exodus, because it meant the land came back to him free and clear. The cowboys who'd been working the various ranches around Cowboy Creek followed the economy the way cowboys always did. Where there was work, they went. 3 of the 4 hands who'd worked the Caldwell operation rode south looking for contracts on bigger ranches. A drifter named Cole, who'd been loosely attached to the Hennessy brothers, simply evaporated. The remaining men who gathered in the saloon on Saturday nights grew fewer as April became May, and there was a general feeling in Cowboy Creek that the place was emptying out the way water empties from a cracked barrel, slowly, steadily, inevitably. Paul Monroe had arrived in Cowboy Creek the previous autumn, just a few weeks before Thomas Garrison got sick. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that men who worked outdoors became lean, with dark eyes under a hat brim that he kept tilted at an angle that was habitual rather than affectation. He had come from east of the Caprock, from a ranch near Amarillo that had sold when its owner died, and he was looking for steady work rather than drifting, which was an important distinction in a territory full of men who couldn't tell the difference between those two things. He had found work with Thomas Garrison odd jobs at first, then a regular arrangement through the fall harvest, and he had been sleeping in the barn loft and eating at the Garrison table when Thomas got sick. He had helped Annie through those hard November weeks without being asked and without making much of it. He brought water and firewood. He kept Chester fed and the hens tended. He rode to the trading post for medicine that turned out not to help, and for the preacher who came out and said words over Thomas Garrison while the man was still breathing, which was the custom out there when it was clear how things were going. Paul had stood at the back of that small room with his hat in his hands, and his expression arranged to be steady and useful rather than pitying, and Annie had noticed that distinction, though she hadn't had words for it at the time. After Thomas died, most people assumed Paul Monroe would pack up and go. There was no formal employment anymore. The Garrison homestead couldn't pay much. Any self-respecting cowhand with his skills could find better wages elsewhere, and the other men who had been drifting through Callow Creek that fall did exactly that. They drifted out as soon as the work dried up and the weather turned. But Paul Monroe stayed. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He didn't ask Annie's permission or make any declarations. He just kept showing up at the barn in the morning and doing what needed doing. And when Annie came out with breakfast for two as she had done all through the fall, he sat down and ate it without making the moment strange. They had an arrangement that was never fully spoken aloud. He worked the land and kept the place running in exchange for room and board, and a small wage that Annie paid him from the dwindling savings her father had kept in a tin box under the floorboard. The savings ran out by January, and after that the wage went away, but Paul Monroe stayed. Annie noticed. She noticed in the way that people notice things that matter too much to say directly. She noticed when he repaired the fence line on the eastern pasture in February, working alone in the cold with methodical steadiness, not complaining, not rushing. She noticed when he rode all the way to the trading post in a near blizzard in March, because one of the hens had stopped laying, and he wanted to ask old Clarence at the post whether there was something useful to be done about it. She noticed when he sat on the porch steps on quiet evenings and played a few chords on a battered harmonica he kept in his shirt pocket, never playing too long, just enough to put something musical into the silence of the plains without drawing attention to himself for doing it. She was grateful for all of it, deeply and specifically grateful, in the way she had been raised to be, quietly, practically, without fanfare. She showed it by making sure his coffee was hot in the morning and his supper was real food, and not just whatever was available. She showed it by keeping his work shirts clean and mended. She showed it by asking his opinion on the land decisions that needed to be made, when to plant, how much to plant, whether to try for a second crop of something in the summer or whether the water would hold, and then actually listening to what he said, which was the most genuine form of respect she knew how to offer. But she never took it for granted. That was the thing that sat between them and grew, quietly, the way things grow in good soil when nobody is watching too closely. She saw him every single day, and she was never once careless about what it meant that he was there. The spring planting had gone well enough, considering. Paul had suggested they simplify fewer crops, focus on what the soil and the water could reliably support, grow food for sustenance, and the one cash crop that made sense for the land, which in that part of Texas meant sorghum. Annie had agreed, and they had planted in late April with just the two of them working from early morning until the light gave out, and it had been exhausting and companionable and strangely good, working that hard alongside someone who worked that hard, and Annie had found herself thinking about Paul Monroe in ways that surprised her, and that she had firmly set aside because the debt to Harold Fitch was real, and the harvest was months away, and she could not afford to think about anything else. But then Harold Fitch came back on a Monday morning in the middle of May, and this time he brought his son, a man named Durant who had his father's calculation and none of his patience for pretense. And Durant Fitch stood in the yard with his thumbs in his belt and looked at the homestead the way a man looks at a thing he is already planning to own. $600 by November 1st, Harold Fitch said, standing on the porch with his hat perfectly placed on his head. That's what the note says, Miss Garrison. I want to make sure you understand the situation clearly. Annie stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her spine as straight as a fence post. I understand the situation exactly, she said. The land is good land, Durant Fitch said from the yard, not looking at Annie but at the fields, at the new green of the sorghum coming up. My father has been patient, but patience has a limit. I didn't ask for your assessment of the land, Annie said, and I didn't ask you here. Durant Fitch smiled in a way that had nothing warm in it. Just making conversation, Miss Garrison. After they rode out, Annie stood in the yard for a long moment with the morning sun already hot on her shoulders. She heard Paul come out of the barn behind her. She heard his footsteps on the dry earth, and she heard him stop a few feet away, not crowding her, giving her the space she needed to think. You heard that, she said. Enough of it, he said. She turned around. He was standing with his hat pushed back on his head, and his expression was that steady, careful thing she had come to rely on, not pitying, not alarmed, just present, just there. $600 by November, she said. Sorghum could do it, he said, if the summer rains come in. And if we can get it to market in Clarendon without paying half the price to a middleman. That's a lot of ifs, Annie said. It is, he agreed, but they're not impossible ifs. She looked at him for a moment. There was something she wanted to say that she didn't have the right words for yet, something about what it meant that he was still here, something about the fact that he could be anywhere in Texas right now, and instead he was standing in her yard talking about sorghum yields and harvest logistics, and all of that was inside her, taking up more room than she'd expected it to take up. She looked at him and she just said, "Thank you, Paul." He looked back at her and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was almost a smile. "You do the same," he said simply. She wasn't sure that was true, but she appreciated that he thought so. The summer of 1876 was a summer of labor. Annie and Paul worked the 40 acres the way two determined people work something, with organization and stubbornness, and the occasional laughter that comes from being too tired to be anything but honest. The sorghum grew. The heat came down hard in July, a blistering wall of it that made the air shimmer and turned the ground to something like brick. And they got water from the creek with a hand-dug channel that Paul extended further upstream, where the water ran a little cooler and a little more reliably, working on the channel in the evenings after the main work of the day was done, digging in the early dark while Annie held the lantern and handed him tools. It was on one of those evenings that they first talked about something other than the work. She had been sitting on the bank while he worked on the channel, lantern set in the grass beside her, and they had finished the immediate task, and neither of them had moved to go back to the cabin yet. And the night was coming in soft and purple over the plains, and the creek made its quiet noise around them. And Paul sat down on the bank a few feet from her and took out his harmonica and played a few quiet notes without making a thing of it. "Where are you from?" Annie asked. "You've never actually said." He lowered the harmonica. "East Texas originally, grew up in a town called Carthage. My father had a timber operation." "You're a long way from timber," she said. "I am," he agreed. "Went west when I was 17, worked cattle mostly. Worked a ranch near Amarillo for 6 years until the man who owned it died and his family sold the land. That's when I came this way." "Do you miss it, the ranch near Amarillo?" He thought about it genuinely, which was one of the things she appreciated about him. He took questions seriously, gave them actual consideration rather than answering on reflex. "I miss the horses," he said finally. "It was a good remuda. And I miss the cook, an old man named George who made a beef stew that I have not been able to find the equal of in 3 years of looking." Annie laughed, which felt good. She hadn't laughed very much since the previous November. "Is that the only thing you look for? Good stew?" Among other things, he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that was quieter and more deliberate than the easy tone he'd been using, and Annie felt it land somewhere in the middle of her chest and stay there. "What else?" she asked, and her own voice was quieter than she'd intended. He looked at her across the lantern light. His dark eyes were serious and honest in a way that was characteristic of him, that careful honesty that she had been noticing all year. "Somewhere worth staying," he said. The night held them both for a moment. The creek ran. The lantern flame moved in a breath of wind. Annie looked at Paul Monroe and felt something settle in her that she recognized, finally, for what it was, not just gratitude, not just reliance, not just the particular warmth that comes from having someone dependable near you. This was something else. This was the thing she had been keeping in the corner of her mind and not looking at directly for 6 months. She said, "You've been worth more to me than I know how to say, Paul. I want you to know that." He held her gaze. "Annie," he said, and there was her name in his voice with a weight to it that she had never heard before, and then he stopped as though he were measuring something. "You can say it," she said. "Whatever you're measuring." A beat of silence. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Not in November when the debt is settled, and not after, if you'll have me here." The words were simple, and the meaning of them was not simple at all, and Annie felt the truth of them move through her like water moves through dry earth, everywhere at once and necessary. "I'll have you here," she said. "I very much will." They did not kiss that night. They sat on the creek bank a while longer with the lantern between them and talked about things that mattered to them. Her father, his time in the timber country, the strange beauty of the Llano Estacado at dusk, the way the stars looked different out on the plains than they did under a tree canopy. They talked the way people talk when they are discovering that the other person's mind is a place they want to spend time in, not just their company. And they walked back to the homestead under those enormous Texas stars, with the particular comfortable nearness of people who have said something true to each other, and don't need to rush whatever comes next. But the summer was not without its difficulties, because the summer in Callow Creek in 1876 was not a thing that stayed simple. 2 things happened in late July that complicated the straightforward arc of work and feeling that Annie and Paul had been living inside. The first was that Durant Fitch began riding by the homestead. Not coming in, just riding by the eastern fence line on the road, at a pace that was too slow to be purposeful and too regular to be coincidence. He did it 3 mornings in a row, and on the 4th morning Paul was mending fence on the east pasture when Durant came by, and the 2 men looked at each other across the fence line, with that particular wordless communication of men who understand each other's intentions perfectly, and are deciding how much to say about it. Paul straightened from the fence, hammer in hand, and Durant Fitch pulled his horse up on the road and rested his forearms on the saddle horn and said, "Monroe, isn't it? You're still here, I see." "Still here," Paul said. "Working for wages or working for something else?" Paul's expression did not change in any visible way. "Working," he said. Durant Fitch smiled that empty smile. "My father owns the debt on this place. Come November, one way or another, the situation changes. You might want to consider your options ahead of time. A man with your skills could find steadier ground." "I'm comfortable with the ground I'm on," Paul said. Durant looked at him for another moment, then straightened up and touched his hat in a gesture that was mocking rather than polite, and rode on down the road. Paul went back to mending the fence. He didn't mention the exchange to Annie directly, but Annie had seen it from the cabin window, and she came out with water for him, and they both stood at the fence line and didn't speak for a moment, and Paul handed her back the empty cup and said, "He won't be a problem." "How do you know?" Annie asked. "Because he's testing to see if I'll leave," Paul said. "And I won't. So eventually he'll have to try something else." "And if he tries something else?" she asked. Paul looked at her steadily. "Then we handle that when it comes." The second complication of late July was the rain. The summer rains did come, Paul had said and they came in, but they came wrong. They came in 2 days of absolute downpour in the 3rd week of July that were more than the dry ground could absorb, and the creek flooded its banks and took out a section of the water channel they had dug. And more than that, They took out about a quarter acre of the young sorghum crop on the lowest part of the field. The plants simply drowned in standing water before it drained away. Annie stood at the edge of that field when the rain stopped and looked at the damage and felt a very cold, very specific fear move through her. A quarter acre of sorghum was not everything. It was not the end. But it was a percentage of the yield that they could not easily replace, and the mathematics of November were already tight. Paul stood beside her. He didn't try to make it seem smaller than it was, which was one more thing she loved about him. She was using that word in her own mind now, loved, turning it over quietly like a smooth stone. He didn't minimize or perform optimism. He looked at the damage and calculated it honestly. "We're still viable," he said. "If the remaining crop comes in full and the price holds, we need to think about whether there's anything else we can do." "What else is there?" Annie asked. "I could take on some contract work," he said. "Branding season runs through August. There are ranches south of here that pay by the head. I could ride down and come back in 3 weeks with enough to put a cushion under the harvest." Annie turned to look at him. The idea of him being gone for 3 weeks felt disproportionately difficult in a way that told her more about herself than she had necessarily wanted to know. But she was a practical woman. "That would help," she said. "Yes." "I don't want to leave you here alone with Durant-Fitch riding by," he said. "I'm capable of managing on my own," she said firmly. "I know you are," he said. "I'm not questioning your capability. I'm saying I don't like the idea of leaving." "Those are different statements." She looked at him again. The sun was coming back out after the rain, and it was turning the wet field golden and complicated, and Paul Monroe was looking at her with that honest, careful look that had been wearing down all her careful distances for months, and she said, "I know the difference, and I appreciate it, but go and do what needs to be done. I'll be here when you get back." He left 2 days later on his horse, a sturdy bay gelding he called Jericho, with 3 weeks of provisions in his saddlebags, and a plan to work the branding operations at a large ranch south toward Clarendon. Annie watched him ride out from the porch, and the strange ache of that, watching someone ride away from her when she was accustomed to watching people ride away and not come back, was significant enough that she had to press her hand flat against the porch post to keep herself very still. But he had said he was coming back, and she had learned over 8 months that Paul Monroe said exactly what he meant and meant exactly what he said. She managed. She was Annie Garrison, and managing was what she did. She kept the remaining crop watered from the repaired channel. She repaired 2 fence sections herself, learned from watching Paul, using the tools the way he had shown her, the particular angle and force required. She fed Chester and the hens and kept the books in the worn ledger her father had kept, and made her calculations about November with a stubborn pencil and a stubborn mind. Durant-Fitch rode by twice more in Paul's absence. The second time, he stopped his horse at the fence and called out to her in the field. Annie straightened up and looked at him from a distance. "Miss Garrison," he called, "your hired man seems to have gone." "He has business to attend to," Annie said clearly. "As do I." "My father would consider a conversation," Durant said, "about an arrangement other than the cash payment. There are different ways to settle a debt." Annie knew exactly what that meant. Harold Fitch had been making quiet comments about the land since winter, and the arrangement Durant was referring to was the kind that left a woman on her own property in a position that wasn't really her own anymore. She had heard of it happening in other towns, other counties. A woman alone with a debt and a patient creditor who eventually offered to forgive the debt in exchange for the land or something worse. "The debt will be settled in cash on November 1st, Annie said. "There is no other arrangement to discuss," and she turned back to her work. Durant did not push it further, not that day, but the fact of his presence and his suggestions was a pressure she felt in the back of her mind while she worked, an added weight to the summer's already considerable demands. Paul came back on a Thursday evening in late August with $112 in his money belt, and a new rope coiled on his saddle, and a look on his face when he rode up the lane, and saw her standing on the porch that was not complicated at all. It was simple and direct, and it was the look of a man coming home to the thing that matters most to him. Annie came off the porch and met him in the yard, and he swung down from Jericho, and they stood 2 feet apart, and she looked at him with 3 weeks of his absence behind her and said, "You look tired." "I worked hard," he said. "Did you eat properly?" "Better than adequately. The cook at the Parker Ranch was exceptional." "Better than George's stew." A genuine smile, one of the real ones she'd been cataloging all year. "Different category of excellence," he said. "George remains the gold standard." She laughed and then, without planning it, stepped forward and put her arms around him. Because he was back, and the relief of that was bigger than any composed gesture could contain. She felt him go still for half a second, surprise, and then his arms came around her, warm and solid and absolutely certain, and they stood in the yard with Jericho watching them and the evening light going copper across the plains. "I missed you," she said into his shoulder. "I thought about you every day," he said into her hair. "Every single day." He brought the money into the cabin and set it on the table, and they went through the numbers together. The 112 from the branding work, plus the cash Annie had saved from selling eggs and a small amount of preserved goods to the trading post through the summer, and the projection for the sorghum harvest. It was close. It was very close, but it was possible. If the harvest came in at the yield they were expecting and the price held at the going rate in Clarendon, they would have enough. "We need to get a good price in Clarendon," Paul said. "Not the middle of the pack, a good price, which means I should go in advance and make contact with buyers directly instead of going through a broker." "Can you do that?" "I know a man named Patterson in Clarendon who deals in grain. Met him years ago. He's honest." Paul paused. "More honest than most, which in that business is the relevant standard." Annie looked at the numbers. Then she looked at Paul. "We're going to make it," she said. It came out with more conviction than she had been giving herself in the quiet of her own thoughts. "We are," he said, and then more quietly, "Annie." She looked up at him. They were sitting across the table from each other in the lamplight, the ledger open between them, and Paul Monroe was looking at her with everything clear in his face, all the months, all the work, all the things that had been building between them through the hard, practical business of surviving, and he said, "I want to ask you something, and I need to ask it right." Her heart was moving faster. "Then ask it," she said. He took a breath, slow and deliberate. "I have been in love with you since February," he said. "Maybe before February, if I'm honest, but February is when I stopped being able to pretend otherwise. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm asking if you have any feeling in that direction, because I would like to know, and because I think you deserve to be asked plainly instead of me going on the way I've been going." Annie Garrison looked at Paul Monroe across the lamplit table in the cabin her father had built. With the Texas night outside, and the sorghum growing in the field, and the debt that was almost but not quite solved, and she felt everything that had been accumulating in her all year clarify into something completely simple and certain. "I have been in love with you since April," she said. "When you dug the water channel by yourself and didn't ask me to thank you for it and didn't expect me to notice, and I noticed anyway. That's when I knew." He was very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, just covered it with his and said nothing at all, which was the right thing to say. They sat there a while with the lamp burning and the night outside and their hands together on the table, and eventually Paul said, very quietly, "I'd like to marry you, Annie. Not because of the land or the debt or any practical reason. Just because there is nothing I want more than to be where you are for the rest of the time I have." She turned her hand under his so their fingers interlaced. "Yes," she said, "that's my answer, yes." The harvest came in September, and it was, against the stubborn odds of the summer, a good harvest. The rains that had damaged the low field in July had also watered the rest of the crop thoroughly, and the surviving 3/4 of the sorghum field came in heavy and well developed, and Paul had spoken to Patterson in Clarendon in advance as planned, and Patterson offered a price that was fair and specific. 14 cents a bushel on a yield that came to just over 4,000 bushels, which worked out to $560. They brought in the harvest together, Paul and Annie, working the field from first light to failing light over the course of 2 weeks in September, with Chester pulling the wagon and the whole operation running with the efficiency of people who have been working together long enough to know each other's movements and rhythms without discussion. Annie's hands blistered and healed and blistered again. Paul lost his hat in a wind on the 3rd day and worked the next 2 days in the full sun before Annie found it caught in the fence line on the east pasture and returned it to him with a look that made him laugh out loud in the middle of the field, clear and unguarded. They loaded the harvested grain and drove the wagon south to Clarendon on a Monday in early October, 3 weeks before November 1st. It was a 2-day drive, and they camped the first night on the open plain under those vast Texas stars, with a small fire and their bedrolls on opposite sides of it, which was proper for the time and for the situation, though the distance across the fire felt both necessary and somewhat absurd given what they had already said to each other in the lamplight 2 weeks before. Paul made coffee over the fire, and they ate the food Annie had packed, and the plain spread out around them in all directions with the extraordinary silence of the Llano Estacado at night, a silence so complete it had a quality of sound to it, like the inside of a shell. Annie lay on her back and looked at the stars and felt the particular vastness of being small and alive and very happy for the first time in a long time. "Tell me about your mother," Paul said from the other side of the fire. Annie was quiet for a moment. "She was steady," she said finally. "She had a quality of steadiness that I've been chasing ever since I lost her. She wasn't demonstrative, she didn't say things she was feeling, she showed them. She made things. She made curtains for the cabin windows even though curtains were impractical. She said some things should be beautiful even when practicality argues against it. She sounds like someone you carry with you," Paul said. "I do," Annie said, "and my father too, differently. He worried about everything in advance and was calm about everything when it actually happened, which is probably not a useful way to be, but he made it work." "You have that too," Paul said, "that quality of being steady when things are actually happening." She turned her head to look at him across the fire. He was propped on one elbow looking back at her with the fire between them and the stars above, and he was the most familiar and the most remarkable thing in the landscape. "What about your mother?" she asked. "She died when I was 12, he said. "Fever, same as your father. My father wasn't the same after. He worked harder and talked less, and I think he was trying to stay busy enough not to feel things. I left at 17 because I didn't know how to help him, and being there was just watching him disappear into the work. Did you ever go back?" "Once, when I was 23. He had remarried by then, a good woman, and he was better." We shook hands and talked about the timber operation, and I rode out the next day. It wasn't unfriendly. It was just not the kind of closeness that either of us knew how to build. Annie was quiet for a moment. "Do you want that?" she asked. "Closeness, the kind that's built." He looked at her across the fire with that steady honesty. "I have wanted nothing else my entire life," he said, "and I have never had it until now." She felt that settle into her and stay. They reached Clarendon the next day and found Patterson at his grain operation, and settled the transaction with handshakes and a signed receipt, and $560 in a canvas pouch that Annie put inside her coat for the drive back north. They spent one night in Clarendon at a proper boarding house, Annie in a room with a window that looked out at a main street with a bank and a hardware store and a hotel, and she sat at that window in the evening and thought about how different the world looked when you weren't drowning in it. They drove back north over 2 days, and on the evening of the second day, coming into Callow Creek from the south road with the harvest money in Annie's coat and the empty wagon creaking behind Chester, Paul said, "I'd like to speak to the preacher." Annie looked at him. "Reverend Hatch." "Before we go to Fitch," Paul said, "I'd like to speak to Hatch first." She understood what he meant, and she said, "Yes, let's do that." Reverend Hatch was a thin, serious man who had been in Callow Creek for 5 years, and had married and buried more people than he'd had in his original plan for ministry. He received Paul and Annie on a Wednesday morning in his church that leaked when it rained, and he asked them the direct questions: were they of a mind to be married? Was there any impediment? Were they proposing this freely? And they answered all of it directly, and Hatch said he could marry them that Sunday if they liked, and they said they liked. They went to Harold Fitch after that. Harold Fitch sat behind the counter of his trading post and looked at the canvas pouch on the counter in front of him with an expression that shifted through several things: surprise, recalculation, and something that was almost but not quite respect. $600, Annie said. The debt paid in full. This is early, Fitch said. The note says November 1st, Annie said. It is October 8th. I am aware that it is early. I would like a receipt. Fitch counted the money. He had to count it twice, which Annie suspected was not because he made an error the first time, but because he needed the moment to manage his reaction. Durant was not there. Annie was grateful for that. Fitch wrote out the receipt in his cramped hand and passed it across the counter, and Annie folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "You're keeping the homestead," Fitch said. It was not entirely a question. "It is my homestead," Annie said simply. "Yes." She and Paul walked out of the trading post into the October morning, and Annie stopped on the boardwalk outside and held the receipt in her hand, and felt the weight of the past year fall away in layers. The way heavy clothes come off after a long, cold trip, the grief of her father's death, the fear of the debt, the grinding exhaustion of the summer, the particular loneliness of being a woman alone in a hard place. Not all of it gone, because grief doesn't go entirely, but the crushing part of it, the weight of it, lifted. Paul stood beside her on the boardwalk, and she looked at him and said, "My father would have liked you." He received that with the gravity it deserved. "I hope so," he said. "He would have," she said. "He could tell about people. He always said you could know a man by what he did when there was nothing to gain from doing it. He would have liked you very much." Paul reached out and took her hand on the boardwalk in front of the trading post in Callow Creek, in full view of anyone who happened to be passing, and held it in both of his, and it was the most public and certain declaration he could have made there then, in that time and place. They were married that Sunday. Reverend Hatch presided in the leaking church, and the few remaining residents of Callow Creek attended old Clarence from the trading post, who had outlasted Harold Fitch in the community's affection by many years. A family named the Ortegas, who had a small homestead west of the creek, and had been in Callow Creek longer than anyone and were not leaving. A young couple named Ray and Sarah Tibbetts, who had arrived in the spring and were homesteading the old Caldwell claim, and a few others. It was not a large gathering, but it was a genuine one. Annie wore her mother's dress, which she had kept in the cedar chest under the bed since her mother's death 13 years before. She had let it out in the bodice and taken in the waist, and the result was imperfect in a handful of technical ways and perfect in every way that mattered. She stood at the front of the leaking church in her mother's dress with Paul Monroe beside her and Reverend Hatch before them. And when Hatch asked if she took this man, she said yes with a clarity and certainty that probably carried out to the Llano Estacado. Paul had no ring to offer. They had not planned for that, or rather, they had planned for the November payment and then a wedding, and had not gotten to the specifics of a ring in the order of priorities. And he said so honestly to Hatch, and Annie said it didn't matter. And Paul reached into his shirt pocket and took out his harmonica and held it out to her with a slightly rueful expression and said, "This is everything I have in my pockets right now. I will get you a proper ring." Annie looked at the harmonica and laughed, a full, genuine laugh that filled the church, and took it from him and held it. And Hatch declared them married with a slight smile. And Paul Monroe kissed his wife for the first time in front of Reverend Hatch and old Clarence and the Ortega family and the Tibbetts and the thin autumn light coming through the church windows. And it was a kiss that held everything. All the months, all the work, all the careful noticing, all the deliberate staying. And Annie held the harmonica in one hand and her husband's face in the other, and thought that she had never in her life been so thoroughly, completely sure of a thing. There was no elaborate celebration after because Callow Creek was not a place that did elaborate. There was food contributed by the families who had come, a table set up outside the church in the October sun, and there was laughter and conversation, and the Ortegas had brought a fiddle player, named their cousin Miguel, who played reels and slow songs with equal enthusiasm, and Paul and Annie danced in the dirt outside the leaking church with the plains spread around them in every direction, and it was the best afternoon Annie could remember. That ring came 3 weeks later. Paul had written to a jeweler in Clarendon, and the answer to the letter was a small package delivered by the post rider who came through Callow Creek once a month. A simple gold band that Paul put on Annie's finger at the kitchen table one morning while she was pouring coffee, slipping it onto her finger with a quiet seriousness that made the gesture more ceremonial than a big production would have. She looked at it on her hand and felt the weight of it, a small weight, a ring weight which is not much and is everything. The winter of 1876 into 1877 was, compared to the previous winter, something close to peaceful. The homestead was solvent. The debt was paid. Chester was fed and the hens were laying, and the cabin had a patched roof, thanks to Paul's work in October before the cold came in. They had enough stored food to last the winter easily, and enough firewood stacked against the north wall of the barn to keep the cabin warm without anxiety. They fell deeper into each other in the particular way that a marriage falls deeper when the survival pressure lifts, and what's left is just the two people and the ordinary days. Paul read in the evenings from the small collection of books Annie had, her father's Bible, a history of the Texas Republic that was missing its first 50 pages, 2 novels of the kind that were written for entertainment rather than literature, but were excellent entertainment, and a book on practical farming that Paul had bought in Clarendon, and that Annie had taken to reading in the evenings with the attention of someone who found the information genuinely interesting. They talked. They had always talked, but with winter keeping them close and the urgency of survival replaced by the ease of security, they talked differently, longer, wider, about things that had nothing to do with sorghum yields or fence repairs or money. Paul told her about the landscape he had moved through in his years of working cattle, the breaks near Palo Duro Canyon, where the canyon walls turned colors at sunset that had no names in English or any other language he knew, the wide silence of the staked plains in winter, the particular quality of Texas sky that was different from every other sky. Annie told him about her childhood before her mother died, the small brightnesses of it, a dog she had loved named Sam, a teacher at the school in the town they had briefly lived near who had given her a book of fairy tales that she had read until the covers fell off, the way her parents had been together, that easy steadiness. They talked about things they wanted. Paul wanted horses, eventually, not just Chester but good horses, working horses, maybe a breeding operation on a small scale. Annie wanted to expand the garden in spring, a proper kitchen garden with vegetables that went beyond necessity, things that were good and not just sustaining. She wanted to write to a school board somewhere about whether a school might eventually come to Callow Creek, because the Ortega family had 3 children and the Tibbets had 2, and there were a handful of other children in the scattered homesteads around the creek. A school, Paul said, in the tone of a man genuinely considering the idea. Children need to learn, Annie said. Our children will need to learn, Paul said, very carefully watching her face. She looked at him across the table with that same certainty she had been feeling since October. Yes, she said, they will. Spring came with all its urgency and renewal. The planting of 1877 was different from 1876, not the emergency planting of 2 people trying to save a place, but the considered planting of 2 people who owned the place and were building something in it. Paul had proposed a larger sorghum acreage, same as the previous year's full field rather than the reduced field, plus a section for corn that was a calculated risk and turned out to be a good one. Annie had her kitchen garden. She planted it in late March, and it came up in April with a variety that pleased her every morning when she went out to check it, the different greens and the growing things in their orderly rows. In April of 1877, Paul bought 2 horses at an auction in Clarendon. He came back from the auction with a dark roan mare he named Clara and a young gray gelding that was 3 years old and needed work, and he led them both into the barn and introduced them to Chester with the seriousness of a man introducing house guests. And Annie stood in the barn doorway watching her husband talk quietly to 3 animals and felt a happiness in her chest that was so consistent it was almost like weather. He had a gift for horses. She had suspected it from watching him with Jericho and Chester, but the 2 new horses confirmed it. Clara was wary with everyone and came to Paul within 2 days, following him around the paddock with an attention that was almost dog-like. And the young gray, whom Paul named Amos, responded to his patient work so quickly that by the end of the first month Amos was carrying a saddle and doing the useful work of a riding horse without any of the resistance that was common in a young horse still being shaped. "You have a quality with them," Annie said one evening, leaning on the paddock fence watching him move through the horses. "A patient quality." "Same thing you need with most good things," Paul said, not looking up from the young gray's left rear hoof he was examining. "You can't push them, you have to let them come." Annie smiled at the side of his face. "Is that what you did with me? Let me come to you." He looked up at that. His expression was perfectly serious. "I waited for 9 months," he said, "and I was not sure of the outcome for most of them." "Were you really not sure?" she asked. He considered it honestly. "There were moments," he said, "when you looked at me in a certain way and I thought maybe, but I wasn't going to push, so I waited. That patience is how you got Jericho and Clara and Amos to trust you," she said. "And you," he said simply. She pushed off the fence and walked into the paddock, and he was still crouching over Amos's hoof, and she crouched down beside him and looked at whatever he was looking at in the horse's hoof, and their shoulders were touching, and she said, "You have it, you know. The thing you said you'd been chasing all your life. The closeness that's built." He let Amos's hoof down gently and turned his head to look at her, and they were very close, both crouched in the paddock dirt with the evening light on them, and he said, "I know. I feel it every day." He kissed her in the paddock with Amos standing patiently beside them, and Clara watching from across the fence with what Annie would later describe as polite interest. And it was one of those kisses that carried in it the particular warmth of a love that has moved past the uncertain early territory and is living now in the deep country of certainty, where you know the other person completely and you want them more for it. Summer of 1877 was easier than the summer before. The rains came in evenly, the crop grew well, the kitchen garden was producing more than Annie could use, and she began trading the surplus at the trading post. Not to Harold Fitch's enterprise, but to a new trading post that had opened on the north side of Callow Creek, run by a man named Ed Bowman, who was honest and competent, and had better prices than Fitch. Fitch's grip on Callow Creek had been loosening since the previous fall. Without his debtors, he had less leverage, and the arrival of Bowman's competition had made his pricing less advantageous. Durant Fitch had left Callow Creek in the spring to try his fortunes in a town further west, and Harold Fitch himself was older and quieter and less powerful than he had been the year before, which was a comfort. The injustice of Harold Fitch's operation was something that Paul and Annie had talked about during the winter, the way he had structured his loans to be unpayable, the way he had used the desperation of settlers to accumulate land and leverage, the way the Caldwells and the Hennesseys and Sadie Pratt had been pushed out. It was a thing that happened across the territories in those years, men with capital using the legal structures of debt and foreclosure to consolidate land and control, and the people most vulnerable to it being the ones who had come west with less, who had borrowed to survive and found the terms shifting under them. It wasn't illegal, which was its own injustice. "I wish the Caldwells had been able to stay," Annie said one evening. "Margaret Caldwell was a friend of mine." "The system is built for people like Fitch to win," Paul said. "That's the honest truth of it. The law is what it is." "Should it be changed?" she asked. "It should," he said. "Whether it will be is a different question." "Someone has to ask the question," Annie said. He looked at her with appreciation. "You should write to the county representative," he said. "You have a clear way of stating things, you always have." "Would they listen?" "Maybe not right away," he said. "But you can plant things even when the ground is not ready. The seed is still there." She wrote the letter. She wrote it in the fall of 1877, a careful, specific letter to the county representative in Clarendon about the practices of creditors in small settlements, and the lack of legal recourse for borrowers when terms were changed without adequate notice. She did not expect an immediate response, and she did not get one. But she sent it, and Paul was right. Some seeds go in the ground before their time and come up later when conditions change. The harvest of 1877 was excellent. Better than the previous year, the full acreage of sorghum plus the corn section, and Paul's contact with Patterson in Clarendon was now a proper working relationship. Patterson specifically sought out Monroe grain because the quality was consistent and the reliability was there. They brought in over $700 from the harvest, which was more than they had ever had, and they sat at the kitchen table the evening of the settlement and looked at the numbers together, and Paul said, "We could start on the horse operation." "How much would it take to start properly?" Annie asked. "2 more mares, good bloodlines, and a structure, a proper paddock expansion with covered shelter. A few $100s to do it right." "Then let's do it right," Annie said. They spent the winter of 1877 to 1878 planning the horse operation. Paul had more knowledge of this than Annie had initially realized. He had worked for a year on a breeding operation in East Texas when he was 21, before the cattle years, and he had learned things there about bloodlines and conformation, and the management of a breeding program that were specialized and valuable. He drew plans for the paddock expansion by lamplight, careful detailed drawings on the backs of old receipts and supply lists, and Annie contributed what she was learning from a book on animal husbandry that Paul had found in the trading post in Clarendon in the autumn. They also learned, in December of 1877, that Annie was pregnant. She had suspected it for 3 weeks before she said anything, carrying the knowledge with a private joy that was also a slight apprehension, not of the pregnancy itself, but of the responsibility of it, the magnitude of bringing a child into the world and the weight of doing that well. She told Paul on a Sunday morning while they were eating breakfast, just said it straight out because she was a direct person and he was a direct person and there was no better approach. Paul Monroe went completely still for about 4 seconds. Then he put down his coffee cup and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I feel entirely well," she said. Another second of stillness, and then something happened in his face that she had not seen before, a complete and total joy that was also vulnerability, the particular look of a man receiving news that is bigger than he knows how to contain with composure. His eyes went bright. "Annie," he said, which was all he could get out for a moment. She got up from the table and went to him, and he pulled her close in his chair, his arms around her waist and his forehead against her, and they stayed like that for a while with the fire going and the December wind outside and Chester and Clara and Amos in the barn, and the fields lying fallow under the winter sky. And it was one of those moments that becomes a landmark in the geography of a life, a before and after point. "We need to make the cabin larger," Paul said, eventually into her hair. She laughed. "We have time," she said. "I want to do it before spring planting so I'm not trying to build and farm at the same time," he said. "That's very practical thinking," she said. "I am a practical man," he said, and held her tighter, and she could feel in the way he held her that practical was not the whole of what he was feeling. He started on the cabin addition in January. He had help from Ray Tibbetts, who had become a friend over the previous year, and from Miguel Ortega's older brother Esteban, who was a skilled carpenter, and who worked alongside Paul for 3 weeks in the January cold while Annie managed the cabin and supplied them with hot coffee and proper lunches at regular intervals. The addition went up on the east side of the cabin, A room that was initially just framed and rough-boarded, but that was weatherproof and solid, with a proper window that Annie had ordered from a catalog at Bowman's Trading Post. The window arrived in February, and Paul installed it with a careful precision that left the frame tight and true, and Annie stood in the new room and looked at the window, looking out at the winter field, and thought about the curtains her mother had made, the ones that were impractical and beautiful. She would make curtains for this window. She made them in February from fabric she had ordered along with the window, a blue and white cotton that was simple and was exactly right, and she hung them in the new room and stood back and looked at them and felt her mother in the room with her for a quiet moment. The baby came in July. A boy born on a Tuesday morning with the summer sun already high and hot, with Reverend Hatch's wife, Mrs. Hatch, who had experience as a midwife, in attendance, and Paul somewhere between the barn and the cabin, in a state of contained anxiety that he would later describe as the most difficult waiting of his life. Mrs. Hatch came to the barn door at mid-morning and called to him, and said it was done and everyone was well, and Paul Monroe crossed the yard in 4 long strides and came into the cabin with his hat in his hands and found Annie in the bed they had been sharing for 8 months, tired and brilliantly alive, holding a small, serious-faced, dark-eyed boy. "Paul," she said, and her voice was the specific quality of tired that is also joy. "Come and see." He came to the bed and sat on the edge, and she put the baby into his arms, and he held his son with the careful certainty of a man who understands weight and value and does not drop important things, and the baby opened his dark eyes and looked up at this particular large person and did not cry. "He has your eyes," Annie said. "He has your chin," Paul said. "That determination is already in it." She laughed and winced slightly at the laugh. "What should we call him?" Paul looked at the baby for a long moment. "Thomas," he said, "if you want to." She felt that land exactly where it should, her father's name. "Thomas," she said. "Yes, Thomas Paul Monroe." Thomas Paul Monroe was a serious and observant baby who developed into a serious and observant small person, with a particular attachment to the horses that manifested as soon as he was old enough to be brought to the paddock. Paul would hold him at the fence, and the baby would watch Clara and Amos, and the 2 new mares with an intensity of attention that made Paul say, with quiet pride, that the boy had the instinct for it already. The horse operation had started properly in the spring of 1878, while Annie was in the last months of her pregnancy, and the work had been divided accordingly. Paul had bought 2 mares with good bloodlines at the Clarendon auction, a deep bay named Mercy, and a pale gray named Francis, and Clara was in foal by spring, and the combination of the expanded paddock and the covered shelter that Paul and Esteban had built made it possible to manage 4 horses, and the growing operation with the kind of organization that Paul had always had in his head when he planned these things. The first foal was born in the spring of 1878, 2 months before Thomas. A roan filly from Clara that came into the world with a stubbornness and a vitality that made Paul name her Stubborn, which became Stubbornly, which Annie shortened to Stubble, which stayed. Stubble was, by the assessment of anyone who came to look at the Monroe horses that summer, an exceptionally good horse, well built, sound, with the temperament that good working horses need. She was spoken for before she was weaned by Ray Tibbets, who had been watching her from birth, and the sale made a profit that confirmed what Paul had believed. There was a market for quality horses in this part of Texas, and he could supply it. The Monroe horse operation grew steadily through 1878 and into 1879. There were more foals, more sales, the reputation that Paul had cultivated as a man who produced honest horses, well-bred, well-started, fairly priced, spreading through the region the way good reputations spread in places where honesty is rare enough to be remarkable. Men came from Clarendon and from places further south to look at Monroe horses, and Paul dealt with all of them with the same straightforward manner he brought to every transaction, and the operation grew. Callow Creek was growing too in those years. The isolation that had made it vulnerable in 1876 was slowly being addressed by the expanding rail lines that were moving west through Texas. And by 1879, there was talk of a rail spur coming through the Panhandle that would bring the region into closer connection with markets and supply chains and the broader world. The school that Annie had hoped for arrived in the spring of 1879. A young woman named Frances Alcott from Missouri, who had come west to teach, came to Callow Creek and established a one-room school in a building that the community had built together on a Saturday in February. And the Ortega children and the Tibbetts children and 4 others began attending, and Annie felt the satisfaction of something she had wanted come into existence. She taught Sunday school at Reverend Hatch's church, and she had started writing a regular letter to the county newspaper in Clarendon about matters of practical concern to homesteaders in the region: land practices, water rights, school needs. And the letters were read and occasionally, increasingly, responded to with policy changes, or at least with the evidence that someone was paying attention. She was building something larger than the homestead, a voice in the community that she hadn't known she had until she started using it. Paul watched her do all of this with an admiration that he expressed in specific ways, by making sure she had time for the writing, by managing the horses so that the morning hours when she was sharpest were hers to use for what she chose, by reading her letters before she sent them and offering observations that were genuinely useful. He was not threatened by her voice or her growing presence in the community. He was proud of her straightforwardly, the way a man is proud of a person he loves when that person is doing exactly what they are meant to do. "You should run for the school board," he said one evening in the fall of 1879, when they established one. Annie looked up from the letter she was writing. "They haven't established one yet." "They will," he said, "and when they do, you should be on it." "Would they accept a woman?" "Probably not everyone," he said honestly. "But some would, and you make a better board member than most of the men who'd put themselves forward, and eventually the results would speak." She considered it. "Maybe," she said. "That means yes," he said, without looking up from the horse ledger he was reviewing. She smiled at the lamp. "Maybe it does," she said. Thomas turned 2 in July of 1879, a solid, cheerful child who had learned to walk at 10 months and had been causing targeted mischief ever since. He had Paul's dark eyes and Annie's determination, and a sociability that seemed entirely his own, a willingness to make friends with anyone and everything, including Chester the mule and the barn cat who went by the name Rector, and was not the sociable type, but who had made a specific exception for Thomas. Thomas ate dinner at the kitchen table now, seated on a special chair that Paul had built with an elevated seat, and he had opinions about food that he expressed forcefully, and Paul would negotiate these opinions with a patience and good humor that Annie found endlessly delightful to watch. "He's teaching you the same lesson you use on the horses," she said one evening, watching Paul convince Thomas that the roasted parsnip on his plate was not, in fact, an enemy. "You have to let them come to it." Paul looked at Thomas and then at Annie with that almost smile. "The parsnip strategy is proving less effective than the Clara strategy," he said. Thomas ate the parsnip, eventually, under protest. In the autumn of 1879, Annie realized she was pregnant again. This news arrived with less apprehension than the first time. She knew now what the pregnancy was, what it asked of her body, what the birth was, what it gave you afterward. She told Paul over breakfast again because the ritual of it had become something she associated with the first time and the particular expression on his face. He did not go still this time. He put down his coffee and said, "How are you feeling?" "Well," she said. "Good," he said. Then the same bright joy in his eyes, quieter this time but no less deep. "Thomas is going to be a big brother." "He's going to be intolerable about it," Annie said cheerfully. Paul laughed. "He's going to be wonderful about it," he said. Eventually, he was right. Thomas was initially intolerable about it, in the specific way of a 2-year-old who does not see the utility of a new baby, and then gradually and then entirely wonderful about it. which was exactly the kind of arc that Paul had been predicting with the patience of a man who understood how things came around in their own time. The second child was born in the spring of 1880, April, when the first wildflowers were coming up on the plains, and Clara's second foal was 3 weeks old and bumping around the paddock on improbable legs. A girl this time, with Annie's gray eyes and Paul's dark hair, and they named her Margaret after Annie's friend Margaret Caldwell, who had been pushed out of Callow Creek in the winter of 1876, a name given in memory and in hope. Margaret Monroe was, from the beginning, a person with a lot to say about everything, which delighted Paul and deeply amused Annie, who recognized the stubbornness immediately. "She has your conviction," Paul said, watching the baby express strong opinions about her swaddling situation. "She has your persistence," Annie said. "She hasn't stopped trying to get her arm free for 20 minutes. The 1880s opened with the Monroes of Callow Creek, in a position that would have seemed like a dream to Annie standing in her yard in the summer of 1876 looking at Harold Fitch riding away. They had the 40-acre homestead, paid and clear. They had a productive sorghum operation and a well-regarded horse breeding business, and a kitchen garden that had expanded into a proper market garden supplying Bowman's trading post, and now a small restaurant that had opened in Callow Creek, when a woman named Rosa Gutierrez arrived from the south and decided the town needed better food. They had Thomas, who was almost 3 and was already demonstrating an affinity for horses that made Paul quiet and happy, and they had Margaret, who was new and powerful and entirely herself. Paul Monroe had his horses and his family and the land he had chosen to stay on, and he worked it every day with the same methodical steadiness he had brought to every task since the morning he had decided not to ride out. And the difference was that now the steadiness came from a foundation rather than a choice, which was not quite the same thing and was immeasurably better. Annie Garrison Monroe had her home and her writing and her community and her children and her husband, and she had never for a single day stopped noticing what it meant that he was there. That was the thing, that she could have grown accustomed to his presence and stopped seeing it clearly, the way you stop seeing things that are always there, the way the mountains on the horizon become background. But she had not done that. She saw him every morning, working, steady, choosing this, and she felt the gratitude of it freshly, consistently, the way you feel sunlight even though the sun rises every day. She told him that one morning in the spring of 1880, standing at the kitchen window, watching him move through the paddock with Thomas on his hip, showing the boy the horses the way he had been showing him the horses since before the boy could form words for what he was seeing. She watched her husband and her son in the morning light of the paddock and the whole of it, the 4 years since that spring morning when he had stayed, the accumulated weight of what they had built settled in her chest in a way that she needed to name. She went to the back door and called out to him. He turned and looked at her across the yard, Thomas on his hip pointing at something in the paddock with great urgency, and Paul's attention divided between whatever his son was indicating and his wife at the door. She said, "I want to say something to you." He came across the yard with Thomas and stopped at the porch steps. "Say it," he said. "I see you," she said. "Every day. I see you choosing this and I never take it for granted. I want you to know that I never have." He stood at the bottom of the porch steps in the morning light and looked at her, and Thomas patted his face impatiently with one small hand, insisting on the return of his father's attention to the paddock situation that was clearly more pressing than whatever the adults were doing, and Paul said, "I know." "Do you really know?" she asked. "I know because of the way you say thank you when you don't have to," he said. "I know because of the way you still look at me after 4 years, the way you looked at me the first time I thought you might feel what I feel. I know it, Annie. It's one of the best things I have." He paused. "It might be the best thing I have." She came down the porch steps and kissed him, which involved slightly elbowing Thomas out of the way, which Thomas found objectionable and made known, and they pulled back from each other laughing. And Thomas, satisfied to have interrupted the adult business, pointed imperiously back at the paddock. They walked back to the paddock together, the three of them, and the spring morning opened out around them with all its Texas space and light, and the horses moved in the paddock, and the new foal stood close to Clara, and Paul set Thomas down at the fence and let him hold a section of the rail and watch the horses with that focused, serious attention that was so purely himself. Harold Fitch left Callow Creek in 1881. He sold his remaining interests, the Trading Post, which Bowman had already effectively undercut, and his third share in the saloon, and moved east to his sister's house in Fort Worth, a diminished man in a place that had gotten smaller than him even as he tried to make it his. There was no satisfaction in his leaving, not exactly, but there was a certain justice in the arc of it. The community that he had tried to pick apart through debt and leverage had survived him, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the quiet persistence of people who had decided not to go. The Ortega family was still in Callow Creek. The Tibbets were still there. Rosa Gutierrez's restaurant was doing well enough that she had hired a second cook. Frances Alcott was still teaching school, now with 17 children in her one room, and a request submitted to the county for a second teacher. The Monroe homestead had become a fixed point in Callow Creek's small geography, a place that people reference when giving directions or describing the area. You go past the Monroe place, past the creek bend, and you'll see the road north. There was something satisfying about being a landmark rather than a debtor. Annie received a response in the fall of 1881 to one of her letters to the county newspaper, not about parsnips or horses or curtains, but about the lending practices letter she had sent in 1877, 4 years earlier. A lawyer in Clarendon named Henry Clark wrote to her to say that a new provision in the state's debt law had been passed, which included some of the protections she had outlined in her letter, and that while he could not say her letter had caused the change, it had been circulated among people who had worked on the legislation, and he believed it had contributed. He asked if she would be willing to write further on the matter of homesteaders' legal rights. Annie read that letter 3 times, then she took it to the kitchen table and read it again. Paul came in from the paddock and she handed it to him without saying anything and watched his face as he read it. "Henry Clark," he said, looking up. "A lawyer," she said, "in Clarendon." "You should write to him," Paul said. "I already started," she said. He looked at her across the table and shook his head slowly in a way that was not a negative but was a wonder. "Annie Garrison Monroe," he said. "What?" she said. "You planted that seed in 1877, he said. 4 years ago, before Thomas was born. You wrote that letter when we were just starting to feel like we'd survived, when you had every reason to just be grateful and not push further. You pushed anyway. You said someone has to ask the question," she reminded him. "I said that," he said. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I was right and so were you," she wrote to Henry Clark. The correspondence became a professional relationship that lasted years. Annie Monroe's letters on homesteaders' rights were read in Clarendon and eventually in Austin, and while the changes they contributed to were slow in coming and partial in their application, which was the nature of legal change, and of justice in a territory that was still finding its shape, they were real, and they were the kind of real that benefited people she had never met, which was the best kind. The homestead grew into a ranch in everything but name over the years of the early 1880s. Paul had expanded the horse operation to a degree that required a proper stable rather than the original barn, and he and Ray Tibbets and Esteban Ortega built it over 2 weekends in the fall of 1881, a structure that was sound and well-made, and that the horses moved into with an equanimity that Paul took as professional validation. The sorghum acreage had been steady and reliable for 5 years. The kitchen garden had long since become a market garden with genuine commercial output. Chester had retired from active labor gracefully and spent his days in the paddock being philosophically observed by Thomas, who had developed a relationship with the old mule that was affectionate and specific. Thomas Monroe at 4 was, as Paul had predicted, entirely wonderful with the horses. He could be found at the paddock fence at all hours and had already developed opinions about the individual horses that were more observations than preferences. He did not pick favorites exactly, but he had assessments, and his assessments were, when you checked them against Paul's more experienced judgment, not wrong. Paul had started bringing the boy into the stable during routine work, letting him hand things and watch, and ask the many questions that Thomas had about everything. And those mornings in the stable became one of the fixed goods of the week for Paul. Margaret Monroe, at 1.5, was a person of great opinions and considerable physical determination, already attempting to follow Thomas everywhere he went, and succeeding more than was probably advisable. She had her father's patience in the exact inverted form. She had none of it. She wanted things immediately and pursued them with a directness that made Annie laugh and occasionally dive to catch something breakable. But she also had, even at 1.5 years, a quality of observation that was quiet and serious, the way she would sit in Annie's lap and look at a thing for a long time before deciding what she thought about it. "She's going to be a scientist," Paul said one evening, watching Margaret examine a pebble with what could only be described as professional concentration. "She's going to be whatever she decides to be," Annie said. "That's what I said," Paul said. Spring of 1882 brought another foal and another pregnancy. The foal was from Mercy, a strong, dark bay colt that Paul named Garrison, which made Annie look at him with a warmth she didn't try to hide. The pregnancy was Annie's third, and she carried it with the ease of someone for whom this was now familiar territory, moving through the spring work of the garden and the summer work of the harvest with a competence that Mrs. Hatch called admirable, and that Annie called simply what needed doing. The third child was born in November of 1882, another boy, fair where Thomas was dark, with Annie's gray eyes and a tranquility of disposition that was immediately apparent, and that he maintained for months with what could only be described as good nature. They named him Samuel, no particular significance, just a name that sounded right, Samuel Thomas Monroe, called Sam from the first day, because Thomas decided immediately that the baby's name was Sam, and the authority of a 4-year-old in matters of household naming was not easily overridden. Paul Monroe stood in the cabin with his 3-day-old son in his arms and his other son at his knee and his daughter asleep in the next room, and looked at Annie in the bed with her hair loose and her eyes both tired and bright, and he said, "I want to say something to you." She looked at him. He almost never led with that. "Say it," she said. "When I came to Callow Creek in 1875, he said, "I was looking for somewhere worth staying. I told you that at the creek, that first real night we talked, and I found it. I want you to know that I have never for a single moment regretted staying. Not through any of it, not the hard winter or the flood or the debt or the July that almost broke the crop. I have never once thought about leaving. I want you to know that." Annie looked at her husband with baby Sam in his arms and Thomas leaning against his leg and the November plains outside the window and the fire in the hearth, and she said, "I know. I've always known. That's what I love most about you, not just that you stayed, but that you never held it over me. You stayed and you just got on with it. There was nothing to hold over anyone," he said simply. "It was what I wanted." "I know that too," she said. "Come here." He came to the bed and sat on the edge, and she took Sam from him, and the baby settled against her with that newborn quality of absolute trust. And Paul put his arm around her, and Thomas climbed onto the bed on his father's other side without asking permission, which was characteristic. And they sat like that, the 4 of them, while the fire went and the plains outside the window turned toward evening. The years from 1882 through the middle of the decade moved with the rhythm of a life that has found its form, not without difficulty, because nothing without difficulty is worth anything, but with the difficulty being the productive kind, the kind that comes from growth and ambition, and the ordinary demands of raising children and running a business, and being in a community that is finding its way. Thomas started school in 1884 at Francis Alcott's expanded schoolhouse. She had gotten her second teacher, a man named Hiram Cross who specialized in mathematics and geography, and Thomas applied himself to the educational enterprise with the same focused attention he brought to the horses. Margaret would start school the following year and already had opinions about it, which surprised no one. Sam Monroe grew into his tranquility. He was a gentle child with a gift for the quiet work. He would sit for extraordinary lengths of time doing focused, careful things, drawing in the dirt or arranging rocks or helping Annie in the garden, with a patience for the small, repetitive tasks of gardening that neither Thomas nor Margaret possessed. Paul said Sam reminded him of George the cook in some essential way, something about the thorough satisfaction in careful work, and Annie said that was the highest compliment he could give anyone. Sam also had, from about age 2, an attachment to Chester the mule that was absolute and mutual, and Chester spent his retirement years with Sam's hand on his nose the way other old animals spend their final years with the sun on their backs. Chester died in the spring of 1885. He went quietly and with dignity, which was characteristic of Chester, in his stall on an April morning when the wildflowers were coming up and the new foals were in the paddock. Paul found him and came to tell Annie, and then they went together to tell the children, and Sam's grief was deep and specific and required the particular comfort that grief requires, not minimizing it, not rushing through it, just sitting with him in it until it could be carried rather than overwhelming. Paul sat with Sam in the barn for most of that morning. He didn't say much. He was there, which was what Sam needed, and Annie watched from the barn door and felt, in that specific moment, the completeness of what she had. A man who knew how to sit with grief without fixing it, who had learned that from somewhere in his own history of loss and had made it into a gift he could give his children. The Monroe horse operation was, by 1885, the best regarded in that part of the Panhandle. Paul had built a reputation that drew buyers from further than the region. A man came from Oklahoma Territory to look at the 3-year-olds in the spring of 1885 and bought 2 and contracted for first pick of the following year's crop. Paul was known as a man whose word on a horse was reliable, which in the horse trade was worth considerably more than the horses themselves. He had hired a hand by this time, a young man of 20 named Ezra Combs who had come from the South looking for work, quiet and hardworking and good with the horses, who slept in the new bunkroom that Paul had added to the stable building and who ate at the Monroe table. Annie noticed, watching Paul with Ezra, that he gave the young man the same treatment he had been given by no one, probably. The direct instruction, the honest criticism, the acknowledgement when things went right. He was teaching Ezra everything he knew about horses without making it a transaction. "You do for him what no one did for you," Annie said one evening. "Someone should have," Paul said simply. "You should have," she agreed. "And now you are." Callow Creek in 1885 was not the town it had been in 1876. It had grown, not enormously. It was still a small settlement on the edge of the staked plains, but it had grown with the kind of organic growth that happens when a community decides to stay rather than go. There were 40-some homesteads in the surrounding area. The school had 30 children in it. Reverend Hatch had built a proper church to replace the leaking one, and the new church did not leak. Rosa Gutierrez's restaurant had a wooden sign and regular customers from as far as a day's ride, and there was talk of the rail spur actually being built, a conversation that had been happening for nearly 10 years and was now, in 1885, moving toward reality. Annie Monroe was on the school board that had been established in 1883, one of 2 women on a board of 5, and she wrote her letters to the county and to Austin and to Henry Clark in Clarendon, and she was known as a voice on matters of homesteaders' rights, in a way that she had not set out to be known, exactly, but that had grown from the specific outrage of 1876 into something larger and more general. She and Paul had conversations every evening that she considered among the best gifts of her life. Not grand conversations, not always about important things, often about the children and the horses and the garden and the particulars of the day, but conducted with the attention and the honesty that had always been the quality of their communication. They had been married 9 years, and she found him interesting in the way she had always found him interesting, which was to say genuinely, not habitually. "Tell me something I don't know about you," she said one evening in the fall of 1885, sitting on the porch in the way they often sat in the evening when the children were in bed and the day's work was done and the plains were going dark and full of stars. He considered it with the seriousness he always gave her questions. "When I was 15, he said, "I entered a singing competition at the county fair. I did not tell my father I was doing it. I sang a hymn and came in second place. The man who came in first was a Methodist minister, and I spent 2 years believing I would have won if he hadn't been a minister, and the judges had been objective about it." Annie turned to look at him. "You sing?" "I sang," he said carefully, "once competitively. I have never once heard you sing," she said. "The harmonica meets my musical needs adequately," he said. "Paul Monroe," she said, "you will sing for me." "I absolutely will not," he said. She laughed and he laughed, and the night was warm around them, and the stars were doing what Texas stars always do, which is occupy the sky with an abundance that has no equivalent elsewhere. And she leaned against him on the porch, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the good silence of 9 years together, and he said, "What don't I know about you?" She thought about it. "When I was 13, she said, "after my mother died, I ran away, got about 4 miles down the south road and sat down in the middle of the road and waited to see what happened." "What happened?" "My father came and found me. He didn't ask why. He sat down in the road beside me and we sat there for a while, and then he said, 'Whenever you're ready,' and we walked back. He never mentioned it again." Paul was quiet for a moment. "That was exactly right," he said. "It was," she agreed. "He knew what I needed. He came and found me and he sat down and he waited." She felt Paul's arm tighten slightly around her. "I think about your father sometimes," he said. "About the fact that I never got to know him. I think he would have been the kind of man I would have been glad to know." "He was," Annie said, "and you are." He kissed her temple and she closed her eyes, and the stars wheeled overhead the way they always had over the Llano Estacado. The same stars that had been there when this was all empty plain and would be there when Callow Creek was something she couldn't yet imagine. And she was here now, in this particular night, with this particular man. And the completeness of it was a thing she held in her chest carefully and with gratitude. The rail spur came through in 1887. It was a local spur off the main line that was pushing west, and it touched the edge of Callow Creek's territory close enough that a small depot was built 3 miles south of the town center. And the arrival of rail changed the economic mathematics of everything in the region the way rail always did. Suddenly the market for horses and sorghum and preserved goods was not Clarendon 2 days south, but Dallas and Fort Worth and points beyond, connected by rail. Accessible in a way that had been inconceivable 10 years before, when Annie had been standing in her field with a debt and a stubbornness, and not much else. Paul Monroe drove 3 horses to the depot in the spring of 1887 and shipped them to a buyer in Fort Worth, the first shipment of Monroe horses out of the region, and the price he got, the Fort Worth price, not the local price, was more than twice what the same horses would have brought in Clarendon. He came back from the depot with the bank draft and sat at the kitchen table and showed it to Annie, and she looked at the number and said, "The operation. We need to expand," he said. "How much land would we need?" They sat at the table with the ledger between them, the way they had been sitting at tables with ledgers between them for 11 years, and made their calculations. And the calculations said they could do it, buy the adjacent parcel to the north. The old Hennessy claim that had come back to the county after the Hennessy's had left in 1876 and been sitting largely fallow since, and expand the operation to a scale that the new rail access could support. They bought the land in the summer of 1887. 40 more acres, adjoining the original 40 to the north along the creek, adding water access and grazing land and the possibility of a larger horse program than Paul had been imagining constrained by the original acreage. Paul walked the new land the day after the purchase with Thomas, who was 10 years old and who understood, even at 10, what this meant, his father walking the land he had just expanded, looking at what was possible. "What do you see?" Annie asked Paul that evening. "Room," he said simply. "I see room to do this the right way." Ezra Combs had been with the Monroes 4 years by this time, and Paul hired a second hand in the fall of 1887, a man named Joe Alvarez who came from a ranching family in southern Texas and knew horses well, and who fit into the operation within 2 weeks as though he had always been there. Paul paid both men fairly and asked for good work in return, and the arrangement worked in the way that fair arrangements tend to work. The children were growing. Thomas at 10 was the clearest extension of his parents. He had Paul's steadiness and Annie's articulate certainty, and the particular combination of those two things was already suggesting a person who would be both reliable and interesting to know. Margaret at 7 was conducting what amounted to a one-person campaign to make Callow Creek more aesthetically interesting. She had opinions about the windows in the new church and the placement of the water trough in front of Bowman's trading post, and she expressed these opinions with a diplomacy that was somehow both effective and charming, which was a talent. Sam at 5 was his own particular thing, quiet and thorough and more tender than the others, already deeply involved in the garden alongside Annie, and demonstrating an understanding of growing things that exceeded his years. Annie Monroe watched her 3 children move through those years with the accumulated gratitude of a woman who had once stood in a field with $400 of debt and 4 laying hens, and could not have imagined this. Not the specific details. She could not have imagined Thomas's laugh or Margaret's architectural opinions or Sam's conversation with a seedling, but the general weight of it, the fullness of a life that had been built rather than just survived. She was 36 in 1888, and she was healthier and more certain of herself than she had been at 24. She had the writing and the school board and the 3 children and the ranch that had grown from the original homestead, and she had Paul Monroe, who was 40 now, with gray coming in at his temples and a particular calm that had deepened over the years from the steadiness of a younger man into something more like bedrock. He worked the ranch with Ezra and Joe and the same daily dedication he had always brought to everything, and he had the horses he had wanted, a string of 20, a breeding program with a reputation that extended far past the Panhandle, a foal crop every spring that was, by his own honest assessment, getting better each year. He still played his harmonica on the porch in the evenings. The children had grown up with that sound as a fixture of summer evenings. A few quiet chords in the dark, never a performance, always just the thing Paul needed to put a little music into the silence. Thomas and Margaret had each gone through a period of trying to learn the harmonica from him, with variable results. Sam had not tried but liked to listen, sitting on the porch step in the summer dark with his father playing, and the ranch around them and the stars overhead, in a kind of peace that required no words. One evening in the summer of 1889, Paul and Annie sat on the porch after the children were in bed, and Paul played a few notes and then stopped and said, without turning to look at her, "Do you remember the night at the creek, the first real conversation?" "Every detail," she said. "You asked me what I was looking for," he said, "besides the stew." "You said somewhere worth staying," she said. "I had been looking for that for 11 years, he said, "since I left East Texas at 17, and I found it. And then you asked if I had any feeling in the direction of love, and I told you I'd been in love with you since February." "You had," she said. "I am still in love with you," he said, in the way I said it then, which was that there was nothing I wanted more than to be where you are. That hasn't changed. I wanted you to know that. 13 years on, it hasn't changed." She looked at his profile in the summer darkness, the familiar lines of his face, the gray at his temples, the battered harmonica in his hand, and she felt all of it. The spring of 1876, and the creek bank in the summer, and the porch in October, and the church in November, and the kitchen table with the lamp and the ledger and their hands together on it, and the 3 children, and the 40 acres that became 80 acres, and the horses, and the letters to Austin and the school board, and Sam talking to seedlings, and Margaret's opinions about windows, and Thomas walking the new land with his father. "I know," she said. "I see it every day. I have always seen it, and I have never taken it for granted, not once, not even one day." He turned to look at her, and in the summer darkness his expression was everything she had learned to read over 13 years, the steady love, the honesty, the quiet deep satisfaction of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. "I know you haven't," he said. They sat in the good silence of the porch, while the Llano Estacado spread out around them under the same stars it had always worn, and the ranch settled into night the way settled things do, and the harmonica started up again, soft and unhurried, a few notes moving through the dark like something that had always been there. And Annie Garrison Monroe leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and felt the specific, irreplaceable gravity of a life that had been built on a foundation of someone who had simply, deliberately, magnificently stayed. Thomas Monroe went to school in Fort Worth at 17, studying at a proper academy, and came back to Callow Creek 2 years later with ideas about breeding programs and veterinary practice that expanded everything his father had built into the next generation, which was always what good work was meant to do. He took over more of the horse operation as the 1890s opened, and Paul watched him do it with the particular pride of seeing your work continued and surpassed. Margaret Monroe at 12 was already writing for the school newspaper that Francis Alcott had started, opinionated pieces about the water supply and the road conditions and the needs of the school, and Annie recognized in those pieces the same clear-sighted practicality that had been in her own letters 15 years before. Margaret went further eventually, further from Callow Creek, further into the world, but she carried the place in her the way people carry the places that built them. Sam Monroe grew gardens. He grew them everywhere, with the same quiet thoroughness that had always been his quality, and the garden at the Monroe Ranch in the 1890s was known throughout the region as the best kitchen garden in the Panhandle, which would not have surprised anyone who had watched Sam at age 3 talking to individual plants, as though each had a specific situation he was trying to understand and assist. Paul Monroe rode his horses and worked his ranch and sat on his porch and played his harmonica in the evenings and loved his wife with the same certain, specific love that he had been loving her with since 1875, and it showed in the way he was with her. The attention he paid, the care he took, the particular smile that was only for Annie. The way he still reached for her hand across a table, the way he had reached for it across the ledger in the lamplight in 1876 when everything was uncertain, and he had said he wasn't going anywhere. He was not going anywhere. He had been nowhere else, really, since the morning he had decided to stay, and the decision had been the best one of his life, and he knew it, and Annie knew he knew it, and neither of them ever let the knowing become ordinary or unconscious or taken for granted. That was the thing in the end that made it extraordinary. Not that it had been perfect, it hadn't, no life is. Not that it had been easy, the summers and the debt, and the flood, and the grief of Chester, and the distance when Paul rode south to the branding operation, and all the ordinary difficulties of building something real in a hard country. But through all of it, the specific quality of what they had, the seeing and the being seen, the staying and the noticing of the staying, that had not diminished. It had deepened the way rivers deepen when they find their true channel, when they stop being just runoff and become the actual water table of a place. Annie Garrison Monroe, standing in her kitchen on a December morning in 1890, with the Texas winter outside, and her 3 children grown or growing, and her husband in the stable with Thomas, talking about horses in the easy shorthand of people who understand the same things, felt the 14 years of it settle in her like something that had found exactly where it belonged. She poured 2 cups of coffee. She carried them out to the stable. She found Paul and Thomas in the middle of a careful discussion about a young mare's confirmation, and she gave them each a cup without interrupting the conversation. And Paul took his coffee and looked at her over the rim of it with that look, the one she had been receiving for 14 years and that still did what it had always done to her, landed somewhere specific and warm and certain. And he said, in the middle of the conversation about the mare, "Thank you." 2 words. The same 2 words she had said to him on the morning of her greatest vulnerability, when he had stayed, and she had needed someone to stay. She had said them, and he had said you'd do the same, and she had thought he was probably wrong about that, and very right about everything else. She smiled at him across the steam of the coffee cups in the December stable with the horses and her son, and the cold, clear light of the Panhandle coming through the door. And she thought that, whatever she had done or not done in her life, she had never once failed to notice Paul Monroe, never once let the seeing of him go casual or careless, never once taken for granted the man who had stayed when everyone else had ridden out. And that more than the land, more than the debt paid, more than the children or the horses or the letters to Austin or the garden or the school board, that was the thing she was most proud of. She had been worthy of his staying. She had seen it and said it and meant it every single day. And he had known, and he had stayed. The ranch in Callow Creek sat on the edge of the Llano Estacado under the enormous Texas sky, and the Monroe family was in it together, built and certain and full. And outside the stable door the winter plains stretched away in every direction without end, beautiful and indifferent the way great spaces are beautiful and indifferent. And inside the stable there was warmth and the smell of horses and coffee, and the low, steady voices of a man and his son talking about good work. And Annie Monroe stood in the middle of it and felt the sun come through the door onto her face, and was exactly, completely, thoroughly home.